I heavily associate the city of York with books, reading, and literature, and after all, why not? With it being the birthplace of one of the earliest English-language novels and significant anticipator of literary modernism, as well as a notable setting for the titular character of a contender for the actual earliest, and considering its status as an emblem of an infamous historical and literary monarchical figure, alongside its honour of being hometown of legends such as W.H. Auden and Alan Bennett, and its place in the devoted hearts of those infamous siblings of immense literary enthusiasm and creative genius, it should be little wonder that I do, and the association has only been affirmed since I took part in 2022's Big City Read, a reading scheme, who'd have thought, initiated by Explore York, and which designated Kate Atkinson's behind the scenes at the museum. It was a bestseller in 1995, lauded for all its psychological depth, its all at once moody, empathetic and humorous spirit, and inventive narrative structure. It's in large part a novel about the infamous worldwide conflicts that shaped that very world into what it is today, and we are audience to the trials of those wars upon 3 generations of a family who inhabit the historically rich city of York, whether it involves the indefinite transportation of prospective husbands and fathers across the world, never to be seen again, or the affliction of numerous individuals with the haunting perception of life's fragility, all the events lingering and informing even their passive perspectives. The Lennoxes, humble, patriotic and proletarian as they are usually at the mercy of these events. What Atkinson chooses to foreground and explore are the notions of identity, its relation to family and its history, trauma, both intergenerational and personal, as well as their repression and attenuation, and spiritual and mental liberation from patriarchal ideology. Its insistence on confining an entire sex to certain duties is a key symptom under scrutiny. If it wasn't for a basic inspectional reading, I'd have embarrassingly fallen into the trap of judging it by its cover, but having finished the novel I can now say that I'm rather fond of it. Regardless, the bold and no-nonsense font on a background of a sheet of ice initially gave me the impression of something very genre-specific and uniform. It threatened a formulaic experience. But while it's true that the presence of the parrot suitably invites questions about its significance and gives the appearance of the book a fittingly eccentric character, one assumes that significance will amount to little more than a motif for crimes or murders rather than an undeniable symbol of female identity and its corruption by the conventions of family creation and maintenance. But I can say now that those blurbs on the front cover weren't exaggerating. When you read it, you feel not only intimately involved in a great many different lives, but critically involved too. One of the primary reasons for this is Atkinson making you feel as if you're sharing an arguably metaphysical space with the narrators, which is more so true of the traditionally labelled chapters at first. Ruby Lennox, as narrator, has no qualms being intrusive, with asides and remarks about the goings-on of the plot, and a sudden use of the second person, or the odd parenthetical expression often encloses impressions of a consciousness which is intriguingly at odds with the voice that makes up the majority of these chapters' discourse. These foregrounding devices of syntactic and pragmatic deviation also serve as an engaging means of characterization when, for example, an understanding of narrative craft and literary culture on Ruby's part is signified through them. Character and themes are further illuminated by the narrative feature of footnotes, chapters that present temporal spaces outside of Ruby's immediate experience, but which are still rhetorically bound by the extent of the perspectives of other members of Ruby's family and ancestors. And where the mainline chapters are chronological, the footnotes, for the most part, are not. This means that readers are tasked with keeping a not insignificant amount of names and the generations those names belong to straight in their heads. The reward for doing so, however, is great indeed. The sizable temporal span of the narrative isn't the only reason for the plenitude of characters, since these are working-class individuals of a very different era, acting in line with a notably partly committed Christianity. They're inclined to produce a relatively large number of offspring. And as you might expect, the subject of religion is explored beyond this matter, illuminating the internal needs of Ruby in particular. The appearance of a sect at one point adds great thematic weight, and acts as one of the many beats in Ruby's journey, that of, in Atkinson's own introductory words, the self toward the light. She affectionately labels this as what literature is all about, a proposition I'm inclined to warmly agree with. Each footnote is cited in the preceding mainline chapter, always embedded in the discourse in question as a parenthetical clause which tends to follow references to certain objects in the representation of action, thought, and speech. Then, in these sizable instances of external discoursal deviation, the significance of these seemingly insignificant things, from rabbit-foots to model zeppelins, is conveyed, through a voice of more omniscience, sophistication, and somberness. A notable example concerns the footnote relating to a spoon quote-unquote belonging to Ruby's mother Bunty, and which effectively encapsulates her lamentation of a life of spontaneity, genuine physical passion, and reciprocated love which she lacks and perhaps feels was stolen from or owed to her. Perhaps more interesting to me was the development of this narrator's character. Early on in my reading, I kept noting certain stylistic quirks which suggested that this was in fact the same Ruby of the mainline chapters, rather than the impersonal third person it suggested itself to be at first. I initially thought that letting the point of view blur in such a manner was a sign of authorial inexperience, but I eventually realised the satisfying suitability of it, both in terms of the narrative and in the context of Atkinson's own creative writing experience, in regard to the process of creative writing, not her capabilities of the time. I realised that if the entire discourse presents the desire for autonomy concerning identity and purpose, and which also presents a central character who is evidently inventive, creative, and a keen academic, her continued but more subdued sense of presence, not to mention her arguable status as an implied author, in the footnotes is fairly appropriate. These days, I like to conceptualize the book, on an abstract level, as a project of creative writing and historical interest being put together by Ruby herself. It subsequently fittingly reads like a process of investigation, contemplation, and of healing. These aspects also solidify its metafictional character. Atkinson herself has talked about how, unknowingly, her original outlet for her creative writing energies were her pursuits within higher education. She has spoken about how she felt she was missing something after she exited her doctoral program.
So after your master's, you started a PhD in American literature.
I did.
You left university without it. What happened?
I think it was the making of me, I think. I always say my success was predicated on failure because I went to Dundee because I didn't get my grades in history, A-levels, and I became a writer because I couldn't do academic writing anymore, and I think that had been a very creative thing for me. And so I went through a kind of grieving period after I failed my doctorate, and I didn't understand what it was at all. Didn't understand what I was grieving for. And then when I started to write, just to write little short pieces, I felt that come back, I felt that I had this outlet for something.
As such, it's almost as if behind the scenes at the museum is an unconscious acknowledgement of this sentiment. Through purposely composing something that is, in a minor stylistic sense, academic, Atkinson is almost attenuating the impact of this particular circumstance in her life. Under such a framework, the discourse portrays an attempt to explore the negative conditions of the Lennox family, a process which is aided by Ruby's ability to comprehend events just prior to her birth, which is no doubt a reference to the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne, the narrator of which also had the privilege of detailed and critical perception of happenstances prior to their own birth. And with that book first being published in York's own Coney Street, the reference also formed part of behind the scenes at the museum's thorough acknowledgement of the city's cultural and historical significance. Even from that point, Ruby comprehends a lack of familiarity with and appreciation of who she will come to know as her direct relations. The semantic characteristic of referring to her parents by their first names as well as their nicknames persisting throughout the discourse being especially indicative of this. Afterward, she often expresses a faint hostility toward them, and often finds herself aggrieved by them. Why exactly this is the case is not only a question the plot endeavours to answer, it also happens to be one of the book's major themes. The desire for liberation from patriarchal conventions and the burden of family responsibility is, ironically, one of the major culprits of the family's many fractures which persistently alienate Ruby. The other major theme of disrupted and lost identity is more overtly realised through a developing mystery regarding Ruby's early childhood, the revealing of which genuinely shook my nerves and induced further sympathy for the Lennoxes. Yes, the story that spans 3 proletarian and war-fodder generations does often make for a fairly miserable one, but I find more often than not that my favourite stories always do. It involves generations suffering unfortunate but common infant deaths, being subject to destructive acts of God, and being dictated by the distrusting ideologies and attitudes at home and abroad. There's a deliberately uncomfortable scene in which direct speech presents the negative associations the extended family make between physiognomy and supposed Jewish heritage. And when the narrative does break away from its darker tendencies at one point, expressing the joy of escape and providing a more optimistic, loving and hopeful setting for the younger generation, it soon enough rather depressingly reveals that these are in fact directly resultant of a particular kind of immorality. Despite all of this though, Ruby manages to develop a more understanding and affectionate attitude toward the family eventually, recognizing the importance of striving to maintain the integrity of a person's identity and memory, in a quest to define herself on her own terms, to free herself from the disruption brought about by both emotional abandonment and the varied and insurmountable cultural and historical forces I've alluded to. Ruby also learns to share the benefit of that endeavour. She earns retribution, she discovers that she has the capacity to forgive, and she finds a very personal kind of freedom. By the end, she strives to bring other selves into that figurative light which its author affectionately mentioned in the edition's pretext. It's not just because I enjoy the story that I have an immense respect for Explore York's choice of text. I respect it because the choice is supremely meaningful when one considers the context of the last couple of years, the trials that the city, the country, and the world have recently braved. This was York's first initiative for the communal reading and discussion of a single book since the COVID-19 pandemic. That fruitful and enlightening practice, which is only possible when people can gather in close proximity, had been prevented and delayed by a deadly global event. The freedom to live and act how you wanted to had been taken away. Behind the scenes at the museum, through its portrayal of generations which were burdened by the effects of deadly global events of different nature, and its designation as the big city read, reflected the real ongoing process of reintegration with and reintroduction to an ordinary and free way of life. Just as the characters of the novel strive to heal and rediscover and redefine their identity on their own terms after traumatic experiences, so too do the citizens of York continue to do so. And the city whose streets, residences, enterprises and businesses you couldn't engage with freely for a time is made newly familiar through reading. For even Atkinson proclaimed that York is a real and very essential character. For me in particular, the book encouraged greater sympathy for the family I moved away from, and incited in me the perspective that despite my stubborn and perhaps neurotic intention to be alone, I am theirs and they are mine. Family, for all its flaws, is all. I shall be returning home soon, but I'll be taking the city I dwelled in and loved with me. It's as Ruby herself says, the past isn't what you leave behind, it's what you take with you. The book will forever lie on my shelf as a responsible representative of York, my time spent living there, and of imaginative literature's potential to not only entertain, but guide and emancipate. Beyond myself, Kate Atkinson's behind the scenes at the museum adds a well-intentioned, comprehensive, sombre and touching portrayal of a fictional set of people who had their lives affected in one way or another by the very real historical forces beyond their many non-fictional equivalents' reasonable control, to a list of favourites which strive to do the same. Read it if you can.